So, hello. We'll continue our work in chapter 18, We'll continue our work in chapter 18, the evolutionary process, ascent and integration. Sri Aurobindo has been setting the stage, describing what the intent of the evolutionary process must be, why it must emerge as it does, and this ascent from darkness through the various grades of being into light is inevitably a staged process. Accession to the level of the human is not the peak of the evolutionary curve. It is a transitional phase which must be replaced by a further growth into a consciousness which really speaks and acts truth, which lives from oneness, which proceeds from disharmony to harmony. Now he will look at the foundation of this evolutionary grade and how it is that we move from level to level. So, we begin with matter. The first foundation in this emergence, the creation of forms of matter, first of inconscient and inanimate, then of living and thinking matter, the appearance of more and more organized bodies adapted to express a greater power of consciousness, has been studied from the physical side, the side of form building by science. But very little light has been shed on the inner side, the side of consciousness, and what little has been observed is rather of its physical basis and instrumentation than of the progressive operations of consciousness in its own nature. So, without drawing directly into the discussion, the orbit of Indian philosophy, when we're talking about the form and the inhabiting consciousness, we're talking about rupa and nama. So there is form building, the shaping of the rupa, and then there is the indwelling side of it, which is the name of the being who inhabits. The name defines the nature of the consciousness that's inside the form. So interestingly, Sri Aurobindo conveys this in a very subtle way in this passage, and stressing the point for us as we look at the principle of evolution that we see the outside process. One form is succeeded by another form, but we aren't following the line of consciousness as it develops, which is more determinative and revealing of what the goal of this cosmic process of evolution is. This is his point. In the evolution, as it has been observed so far, although a continuity is there, for life takes up matter, and mind takes up submental life, the mind of intelligence takes up the mind of life and sensation, the leap from one grade of consciousness in the series to another grade seems to our eyes immense. The crossing of the gulf, whether by bridge or by leap, impossible. We fail to discover any concrete and satisfactory evidence of its accomplishment in the past or of the manner in which it was accomplished. So, put plainly, how is it that life emerges out of matter? Matter is absolutely unconscious, devoid of awareness. So how is it that in that dull, insensate stuff does a throbbing life form emerge. He continues, even in the outward evolution, even in the development of physical forms, where the data are clearly in evidence, there are missing links that remain always missing. But in the evolution of consciousness, the passage is still more difficult to account for it seems more like a transformation than a passage. So we're looking for the inner signs of this growing consciousness as it emerges cosmically, but we can't even trace successfully the links from living form to living form. There are gaps in our knowledge, the famous missing links. Even more so, how is it that out of this brute, insensate matter comes there to be life? And in this living matter, how comes there to be thought? How comes there to be a human? We can't trace the movement from the unconscious to the semi-conscious, and from the semi-conscious to the fully conscious. How does it happen? It seems, as he says, more a transformation than anything else. It may be, however, that by our incapacity to penetrate the subconscious, to sound the submental, or to understand sufficiently a lower mentality different from ours, we are unable to observe the minute gradations, not only in each degree of the series, but on the borders between grade and grade. The scientist who does observe minutely the physical data has been driven to believe in the continuity of evolution in spite of the gaps and missing links. If we could observe similarly the inner evolution, we could, no doubt, discover the possibility and the mode of these formidable transitions. So first, perhaps this is simply because we don't have the conscious equipment to perceive it. Given our limited mind, we can hardly know the mind of the person next door. We don't really understand the intersubjectivity that locks us together. We presume that we understand each other. We share a common vocabulary, etc. But what about the life below us? Eventually there may be a life beyond us. Is the human mind capable of penetrating and understanding that? So, just as the outer scientist, let's say the biologist, the Darwinian, has had to accept that there's just too much evidence to ignore, that the process of physical evolution is a must. You must surrender. There's too much evidence contradicting belief otherwise. If we could observe similarly the facts of the inner evolution, we might arrive at similar justified belief that this is also true. Not only is the fact of outer evolution true, but the fact of inner evolution is also true. This is one of the earlier persons who represents to the thinking world the idea of an inner evolution. That is to say, Sri Aurobindo is a pioneer in this. There were some others, Samuel Alexander and Henri Bergson, etc., but Sri Aurobindo makes a grand thesis of this and unites so many different strands of human knowledge into this endeavor that it becomes a compelling vision. So we continue. But still, there is a radical difference between grade and grade, so much so that the passage from one to another seems a new creation, a miracle of metamorphosis rather than a natural, predictable development or quiet passing from one state of being to another with its well-marked steps arranged in an easy sequence. So we have to look at this. How is it that we get from matter to life? How is it that we get from life to mind? These gulfs appear deep. These gulfs appear deeper, but less wide as we rise higher in the scale of nature. If there are rudiments of life reaction in the metal, has been recently contended, and this is, of course, by J.C. Bose, the great Indian scientist in early 20th century, it may be identical with life reaction in the plant in its essence. But what might be called the vital physical difference is so considerable that one seems to us inanimate. The other, though not apparently conscious, might be called a living creature. So he's suggesting, as Bose did, that even in what seems to be inert metal, in iron, there is a life force. And you can, through the exercise of that life force, demonstrate that that metal will fatigue, just as the life will, and that it will respond differently in terms of its vibrational response to stimulus. So extraordinary work that he did. So while we may in some way be able to detect the presence of a life force, not visible, but palpable to some modes of inquiry, when we look at that as opposed to the difference where the vital and the physical meet, the difference is almost emarginate, almost has no border. The metal seems inanimate, the other seems alive and conscious virtually. So we continue. Between the highest plant life and lowest animal, the gulf is visibly deeper. This is your second example, moving from metal to life, and now from life to animal, from plant life to animal life. For it is the difference between mind and the entire absence of any apparent or even rudimentary movement of mind. In the one, the stuff of mental consciousness is unawakened, though there is a life of vital reactions, a suppressed or subconscious or perhaps only submental sense vibration which seems to be intensely active. So that's the description of the plant. In the other, though the life is at first less automatic and secure in the subconscious way of living and in its own new way of overt consciousness imperfectly determined, still mind is awakened. There is a conscious life, a profound transition has been made. This is a point that he noted often, even in his private conversations, which were recorded by Purani and Anil Baran Roy and others, that he regarded the animal kingdom as being gifted with mentality, that they had working minds, that they could reason, that they could solve problems, that they were aware of themselves, aware of others, that they had ranges and ranges of consciousness development available to them, which we look at with disdain. And yet, they are conscious creatures that we ought to consider our brethren. If we have greater awareness, we ought not to be so proud. We have much to do and much to grow into beyond our current status. But the community of the phenomenon of life between plant and animal, however different their organization, narrows the gulf, even though it does not fill in its profundity. Profundity here means depth, the chasm deep. Between the highest animal and the lowest man, there is a still deeper, though narrower, gulf to be crossed, the gulf between sense-mind and the intellect. For however we may insist on the primitive nature of the savage, we cannot alter the fact that the most primitive human being has, above and beyond the sense-mind, emotional vitality, and primary practical intelligence, which we share with the animals, a human intellect, and is capable, in whatever limits, of reflection, ideas, conscious invention, religious and ethical thought and feeling, everything fundamental of which man as a race is capable. He has the same kind of intelligence. It differs only in its past instruction and formative training and the degree of its developed capacity, intensity, and activity. So in other words, whether we're talking about the noble European or the so-called primitive who lives in an aboriginal condition, they essentially have the same equipment and can, given the same circumstances, produce equally enviable results in terms of their creativity and the justness of the society they will create. Still, in spite of these dividing furrows, and here again we have the image of that plow which is of the secret intent in nature that's carving a path. On one side there's a divide, on the other side there's a divide, but there is a direction to the plow. Sri Aurobindo does see a direction to the cosmos. There is a point in the evolution. It is not aimless. It has a great but secret goal. Hence the furrows. Still, in spite of these dividing furrows, we can no longer suppose that God or some demiurge has manufactured each genus and species ready-made in body and in consciousness, and left the matter there, having looked upon his work and seen that it was good. So, a mocking tone towards the theists in the crowd. It has become evident that a secretly conscious or an inconscient energy of creation has affected the transition by swift or slow degrees, by whatever means, devices, biological, physical, or psychological machinery, perhaps, having made it, did not care to preserve as distinct forms what were only stepping stones and had no longer any function nor served any purpose in evolutionary nature. So nature is conscious. She is a form of Chit Shakti. And that secret conscious will, born in Satchit Ananda, manifest to the creative consciousness of the supramental, is here with us, active. And if she doesn't care to preserve the form that she used as a dispensable utility to advance the cause, and we can't find it, tut-tut. She keeps going. She's relentless. Her mood is ever towards the future. But this explanation of the gaps is little more than a hypothesis which, as yet, we cannot sufficiently substantiate. It is probable, at any rate, that the reason for these radical differences is to be found in the working of the inner force and not in the outer process of the evolutionary transition. If we look at it more deeply from the inner side, from that inner side, the difficulty of understanding ceases, and these transitions become intelligible and indeed inevitable by the very nature of the evolutionary process and its principle. So, let us look deeply with Sri Aurobindo at this. For if we look not at the scientific or physical aspects, but at the psychological side of the question, and inquire in what precisely the difference lies, we shall see that it consists in the rise of consciousness to another principle of being. The metal is fixed in the inconscient and inanimate principle of matter. Even if we can suppose that it has some reactions suggestive of life in it, or at least of rudimentary vibrations that in the plant developed into life, still it is not at all characteristically a form of life. It is characteristically a form of matter. The plant is fixed in a subconscious action of the principle of life. Not that it is not subject to matter or devoid of reactions that find their full meaning only in mind, for it seems to have submental reactions that in us are the foundation of pleasure and pain or of attraction and repulsion, but still it is a form of life, not of mere matter, nor is it, so far as we know, at all a mind-conscious being. Man and animal. Man and the animal are both mentally conscious beings, but the animal is fixed in vital mind and mind sense and cannot exceed its limitations, while man has received into his sense mind the light of another principle, the intellect, which is really at once a reflection and a degradation of the supermind, a ray of gnosis seized by the sense mentality and transformed by it into something other than its source. For it is agnostic, like the sense mind, in which and for which it works, not Gnostic. It seeks to lay hold on knowledge because it does not possess it. It does not, like supermind, hold knowledge in itself as its natural prerogative. So here he's describing how these levels are distinct, even though we can see that they are generally processive, evolving forms of what is inherent in nature, mind out of life, life out of matter, etc. Still, there are separable grades, and we need to recognize them as what they are. And even if we look at mind as being an organ of knowledge, it is looking for outside knowledge. The senses don't get real knowledge. They're agnostic. They have to go out and gather data and formulate something which is a simulation of knowledge. The supermind itself holds knowledge within it because knowledge is truly by identity. You hold it within yourself. Knowledge is self-awareness. One discovers that that being is also me, and therefore I can come to know it in its substance, in its essence, even in its form, by dint of a consciousness which is at one with it. He continues, in other words, in each of these forms of existence, the universal being has fixed its action of consciousness in a different principle, or, as between man and animal, in the modification of a lower by a higher, though still not a highest grade principle. It is this stride from one principle of being to another quite different principle of being that creates the transitions, the furrows, the sharp lines of distance, and makes not all the difference, but still a radical characteristic difference between being and being in their nature. So the emerging principle is able to influence the medium in which it arises. Life is able to have an impact on its material encasement, on its form, but can't transform it utterly, can't do all the work that is possible in the form. Mind is able to make an impact on life, mentalize it, is able to mentalize also through the life power, something responsive to it in the physical shell, but can't utterly transform it either. So there still seem to be differences large enough to say, this is matter, this is life, and that is mind. We can make those distinctions. But it must be observed, he writes, that this ascent, this successive fixing in higher and higher principles, does not carry with it the abandonment of the lower grades, any more than a status of existence in the lower grades means the entire absence of the higher principles. Worth dwelling on that. So he's saying that even though we have this three-layer cake of the cosmos that we move in commonly, matter, life, and mind, they are not absolutely separable. They are included in each other. Does not carry with it the abandonment, so we don't move from one to the other and leave that one behind. We incorporate, we integrate, we combine and synthesize. And he also suggests that the higher principles are present in the lower. He'll make a larger statement about that in a moment. Now, this has an impact on the nature of the cosmos that we have, because traditional cosmology sees a number of worlds. It isn't that the theistic religions, for instance, don't recognize a difference between matter, life, and mind. They just don't see them as evolutionary. They're static. So there are worlds above the physical. There are superphysical worlds in many theistic religions. There are three main theistic religions, I realize. So there are levels of life, there are levels of mind, etc. They're recognized, but they do not influence the earth in those cosmologies. They are static. Sri Aurobindo is drawing a different principle here, in which those worlds, yes, exist as supraphysical realities, but they also indwell this material cosmos and evolve out of it. And he's going to tell you how it happens. He continues, this heals the objection against the evolutionary theory created by these sharp lines of difference. For if the rudiments of the higher are present in the lower creation, and the lower characters are taken up into the higher evolved being, that of itself constitutes an indubitable evolutionary process. What is necessary is a working that brings the lower gradation of being to a point at which the higher can manifest in it. At that point, a pressure from some superior plane where the new power is dominant may assist towards a more or less rapid and decisive transition by a bound or a series of bounds. A slow, creeping, imperceptible, or even occult action is followed by a run and an evolutionary saltus across the border. It is in some such way that the transition from the lower to higher grades of consciousness seems to have been made in nature. So, there is a pressure from the supraphysical life plane upon the sleeping, dormant principle of life embedded in matter, and it responds to that pressure. And through that pressure, a preparation of form occurs until we can make a leap. And same thing is true when mind presses upon living matter, upon plant and animal forms, to find the necessary preparatory stages to create an envelope in which mind can manifest. Now, some of you will be familiar with the Indian mythology and the Upanishads, where the gods are looking at the various forms of life upon earth, saying, we want to take birth. The higher powers of consciousness want to take birth, but they can't find the proper form in the animal kingdom to do that until they happen upon the human and say, this is a form in which I can be born. And so those higher powers of consciousness descend and then manifest in the human. Something of that mythic image is akin to what we see here, because it's describing a psychological reality, something that is occurring in the inner consciousness of nature, behind the scenes, in an occult just means hidden, way. Saltus, by the way, it's a Latin word, means a leap. It means a breach of continuity. You're getting out of the old familiar into something new. So it's an evolutionary saltus. It's an evolutionary leap to a new level of being. It's a jump to conclusion as well. This is the way the Chambers Dictionary, Sri Aurobindo's favorite English dictionary, would describe and define it. That is a saltus. So you see, this occult action is followed by a run and then a leap. A run and a leap, and you land in new territory. You may remember in recent decades we were all taken with the idea of dissipative structuring that Ilya Prigogine mooted in scientific circles, where he was describing open systems and closed systems. How closed systems, it's hard to get something going. You can't really do much in a closed system. But in an open system, you can stimulate, you can throw challenges to an open system, and the open system will respond. It may go through a crisis. Remember that Greek term which means turning point, and you live or you die. But an open system that receives that challenge and responds to it develops greater internal sophistication, greater self and social awareness when it's applied to the human scale, and you have a new order of being. You attain something new. And that idea was applied with enthusiasm back in the 80s to possible explanations of how these jumps occur in evolutionary chains. So I'll leave it to you. If you want to add it to your tea as a masala, well and good. In fact, Sri Aurobindo writes, life, mind, supermind are present in the atom, are at work there, but invisible, occult, latent, and a subconscious or apparently unconscious action of the energy. There is an informing spirit, but the outer force and figure of being, what we might call the formal or form existence, as distinguished from the immanent or secretly governing consciousness, is lost in the physical action, is so absorbed into it as to be fixed in a stereotyped self-oblivion, unaware of what it is and what it is doing. So the supramental is present, but submerged, even in the physical structuring of the atom. The electron and atom are, in this view, eternal somnambulists. They are always asleep. They're sleepwalking. They're moving around, driven by a consciousness of which they are unaware. Each material object contains an outer or form consciousness involved, absorbed in the form, asleep, seeming to be an unconsciousness driven by an unknown and unfelt inner existence. Remember, nama and rupa, rupa and nama, form and name, the continent and the consciousness inside the continent. He who is awake in the sleeper, the universal inhabitant of the Upanishads, Aranyaka Upanishad, which you remember we cited many pages ago, an outer absorbed form consciousness which, unlike that of the human somnambulist, has never been awake and is not always or ever on the point of waking. So this is ground zero in matter. somnambulistic display of energy and consciousness which it does not understand. It is not aware. It is unaware by definition. Now he moves from the material to the vital. In the plant, this outer form consciousness is still in the state of sleep, but a sleep full of nervous dreams, always on the point of waking, but never waking. So here, there is a form, not aware, okay? Still asleep, but the plant life is stirring. It is sensate. Things register to it, but it cannot formulate them in cognitive terms. It does not have a mind with which to do that. And yet, it has these impressions that are drifting through it. Always on the point of waking, but never waking. Life has appeared. In other words, force of concealed conscious being has been so much intensified, has raised itself to such a height of power as to develop or become capable of a new principle of action, that which we see as vitality, life force. It has become vitally responsive to existence, though not mentally aware, and has put forth a new grade of activities of a higher and subtler value than any purely physical action. At the same time, it is capable of receiving and turning into these new life values, into motions and phenomena of a vibration of vitality, life contacts and physical contacts from other forms than its own and from universal nature. This is a thing which forms of mere matter cannot do. They cannot turn contacts into life values or any kind of value, partly because their power of reception, although it exists if occult evidence is to be trusted, is not sufficiently awake to do anything but dumbly receive and imperceptibly react. Partly because the energies transmitted by the contacts are too subtle to be utilized by the crude inorganic density of formed matter. Life in the tree is determined by its physical body, but it takes up the physical existence and gives it a new value or system of values, the life value. So this is the distinction, the divide between the two. What is merely material, instinct with life, and what is living material, with life becoming cognizant, abundant, vibrant. The transition to the mind and sense that appear in the animal being, that which we call conscious life, is operated in the same manner. The force of being is so much intensified, rises to such a height as to admit or develop a new principle of existence. Apparently new, at least in the world of matter, mentality. Animal being is mentally aware of existence, its own and others, puts forth a higher and subtler grade of activities, receives a wider range of contacts, mental, vital, physical, from forms other than its own, takes up the physical and vital existence and turns all it can get from them into sense values and vital mind values. It senses body, it senses life, but it senses also mind. For it has not only blind nervous reactions, but conscious sensations, memories, impulses, volitions, emotions, mental associations, the stuff of feeling and thought and will. It has even a practical intelligence founded on memory, association, stimulating need, observation, a power of device. It is capable of cunning, strategy, planning. It can invent, adapt to some extent its inventions, meet in this or that detail the demand of new circumstances. All is not in it a half-conscious instinct. The animal prepares human intelligence. In fact, if you look at this, it looks like it could be a definition of much of human life. So much of what the animal has accomplished is a tremendous strides forward over what life had been able to establish in its first encampment in matter. Now mind begins to register, and look how much farther it goes. It animates, it moves around, it associates, it thinks, it plans, it strategizes. All that we've learned about the societies of animals in recent decades subscribes to what Sri Aurobindo has written about here. Rather than placing his argument in the shade, it supports with its own light what he proposes in his philosophy. But when we come to man, we see the whole thing becoming conscious. The world which he epitomizes, the human is the world writ small, begins in him to reveal to itself its own nature. The higher animal is not the somnambulist, not walking around in his sleep. As the very lowest animal forms still mainly or almost are, but it has only a limited waking mind capable of just what is necessary for its vital existence. In man, the conscious mentality enlarges its wakefulness, and though not at first fully self-conscious, though still conscious only on the surface, can open more and more to his inner and integral being. As in the two lower ascents, that is, from matter to life, from life to mind, there is a heightening of the force of conscious existence to a new power and a new range of subtle activities. There is a transition from vital mind to reflecting and thinking mind. Vital mind would be where the mind is focused on the activities of life, fulfilling life values, making sure that there's food, that there's vital adventure, that there is assimilation, that there is conquest, etc. All the things that are natural to the vital world. That is what the mind working in the vital seems to want to get. So there is a transition from vital mind to reflecting and thinking mind. There is developed a higher power of observation and invention, taking up and connecting data, conscious of process and result, a force of imagination and aesthetic creation, a higher and more plastic sensibility, the coordinating and interpreting reason, the values no longer of a reflex or reactive, but of a mastering, understanding, self-detaching intelligence. So we can know more, we can do more, we can assimilate data, we can stand back from it, engage it, we can throw it into beautiful form. As in the lower ascents, so here there is also a widening of the range of consciousness. man is able to take in more of the world and of himself, as well as to give to this knowledge higher and completer figures of conscious experience. So too, there is here also the third constant element of the ascension. Mind takes up the lower grades and gives to their action and reaction intelligent values. Man has not only, like the animal, the sense of his body and life, but an intelligent sense and idea of life and a conscious and observant perception of body. He takes up, too, the mental life of the animal, as well as the material and bodily. Although he loses something in the process, he gives to what he retains a higher value. He has the intelligent sense and the idea of his sensations, emotions, volitions, impulses, mental associations. What was crude stuff of thought and feeling and will, capable only of gross determinations, he turns into the finished work and artistry of these things. So if he sacrifices strength and dexterity, he gains deeper intelligence, greater rounds of association, and the capacity to put what is intellectually fine and artistically beautiful into form. For the animal, too, thinks, but in an automatic way based mainly on a mechanical series of memories and mental associations, accepting quickly or slowly the suggestions of nature, and only awakened to a more conscious personal action when there is need of close observation and device, when he's pushed by circumstance. It has some first crude stuff of practical reason, but not the formed ideative and reflective faculty. The waking consciousness in the animal is the unskilled, primitive artisan of mind. In man, it is the skilled craftsman and can become, but this he does not attempt sufficiently, not only the artist, but master and adept. I think we shall leave our bookmark in that place for this week and turn to a passage in Savitri. Fittingly, Book 2, the Book of the Traveler of the Worlds. Canto 2, the Kingdom of Subtle Matter. A mighty kinship is this daring's cause. All we attempt in this imperfect world looks forward or looks back beyond time's gloss to its pure idea and firm inviolate type in an absolute creation's flawless skill. To seize the absolute in shapes that pass, to fix the eternal's touch in time-made things. This is the law of all perfection here. A fragment here is caught of heaven's design. Else could we never hope for greater life, and ecstasy and glory could not be. Even in the littleness of our mortal state, even in this prison house of outer form, a brilliant passage for the infallible flame is driven through gross walls of nerve and brain. A splendor presses, or a power breaks through. Earth's great dull barrier is removed awhile. The inconscient seal is lifted from our eyes, and we grow vessels of creative might. The enthusiasm of a divine surprise pervades our life. A mystic stir is felt. A joyful anguish trembles in our limbs. A dream of beauty dances through the heart. A thought from the eternal mind draws near. Intimations cast from the invisible, awaking from infinity's sleep, come down. Symbols of that which never yet was made. But soon the inert flesh responds no more. Then sinks the sacred orgy of delight. The passion, the blaze of passion and the tide of power are taken from us, and though a glowing form abides, astonishing earth, imagined supreme, too little of what was meant has left a trace. Earth's eyes half see, her forces half create. Her rarest works are copies of heaven's art. A radiance of a golden artifice, a masterpiece of inspired device and rule. Her forms hide what they house and only mime the unseized miracle of self-born shapes that live forever in the eternal's gaze. Here, in a difficult, half-finished world, is a slow toiling of unconscious powers. Here is man's ignorant, divining mind, his genius born from an inconscient soil. To copy on earth's copies is his art. For when he strives for things surpassing earth, too rude the workman's tools, too crude his stuff, and hardly with his heart's blood he achieves his transient house of the divine idea, his figure of a time inn for the unborn. Our being thrills with high, far memories, and would bring down their dateless meanings here, but too divine for earthly nature's scheme, beyond our reach the eternal marvels blaze. Absolute they dwell, unborn, immutable, immaculate in the Spirit's deathless air, immortal in a world of motionless time, and an unchanging muse of deep self-space. Only when we have climbed above ourselves, a line of the transcendent meets our road and joins us to the timeless and the true. It brings to us the inevitable word, the godlike act, the thoughts that never die. A ripple of light and glory wraps the brain, and traveling down the moment's vanishing route, the figures of eternity arrive. As the mind's visitors or the heart's guests, they espouse our mortal brevity awhile, or seldom in some rare delivering glimpse, are caught by our vision's delicate surmise. Although beginnings only and first attempts, these glimmerings point to the secret of our birth and the hidden miracle of our destiny. What we are there, and here on earth shall be, is imaged in a contact and a call. So, namaste, Jai Ma. So we meet again next time in the month of June. It has a significance for us. Much love to you all. Thank you for being with us again. Namaste.